Washington Journal continues.
Kit Batten of the Center for American Progress, assess for us, if you will, the final weekend at the Bali conference and how the United States played a part in that.
Thank you, Rob. The final weekend at Bali was a pivotal moment in the conference. Up till Saturday, went a day over in terms of negotiations, and up until Saturday, we weren't sure whether we were actually going to see a roadmap going forward. The final day, there was still a lot of disagreement over the mitigation language in the roadmap, the language over how emissions would be reduced by developed and developing nations. And moving forward, it was just the United States that stood alone in opposition to the language in terms of measurable, verifiable, and reportable emission reductions for developed and developing nations. But in the end, due to opposition from the rest of the nations in the room, and a rising crescendo of boos and hisses at the U.S. position, the U.S. finally renegotiated its position and accepted the language. So we ended up with a roadmap to move forward that had 4 strong pillars for addressing emission reductions, addressing adaptation needs, addressing the need for technology assistance and transfer to developing nations for low-carbon technologies, and also financing mechanisms for all of those things.
This roadmap is laying out the structure for an agreement that will replace the Kyoto Protocol, correct?
That's right.
When does the protocol expire?
It expires in 2012.
And what's the likelihood that the U.S. might sign on to this new agreement where they weren't willing to sign on to Kyoto?
I think that there's a good chance that the United States will sign on to this new agreement, looking at a new administration coming into office in 2009. And moving forward, already the United States has agreed to language that we've never agreed to before in terms of the possibility of committing to binding emission reduction targets.
And do you think that the U.S. would be likely to sign this new agreement regardless of which party controls the White House?
I think that there's a good chance. Both Republican and Democratic presidential candidates have spoken in support of strongly reducing U.S. emissions and addressing the problem of global warming. So I think that both parties, depending on the candidate, would be willing to sign such an agreement.
There was a hearing up on Capitol Hill yesterday talking about the Bali conference. Tell us a little bit about that hearing and what you expect to come forward out of that.
There were 5 different panelists at this hearing who spoke about the need to reduce emissions soon, because the science is telling us that we need to do that as soon as possible. Talking about the 4 pillars of the Bali roadmap that I mentioned earlier in support of that being a strong framework to move forward. Talking also about how the U.S. unfortunately did not agree to binding emission reductions that were discussed at the beginning of the Bali meeting that would have required developed nations, including the United States, to reduce emissions 25 to 40% by 2020. Moving forward, it's a strong basis for moving forward. Oh, the other thing that was important coming out of that hearing is the discussion of what developing nations are already doing in terms of reducing their emissions. China has put into place a 20% reduction in energy intensity by 2010. China has really strong vehicle fuel economy measures already. China next year will have a fleet-wide fuel efficiency of 37 miles per gallon, which will exceed what we just passed through the U.S. Congress and got signed into law this week of 35 miles per gallon here in the United States by 2020. By 2020, Japan and Europe will have already reached around 50 miles per gallon. So developing nations like China, like Brazil, like Mexico are already taking strong measures to reduce their emissions. And they made it clear at Bali that if the U.S. and other developed nations make it clear that they will take stringent reductions in their own emissions, then developing countries will do even more.
Notwithstanding the President's signature on the energy bill yesterday, which included some emissions reductions points, do you see any legislation coming out of the Congress that will force the administration to do even more to cut back on emissions and bring the United States more in line with what other countries around the world are doing?
Well, we've seen a lot of progress already on the Lieberman-Warner climate change bill that got reported out of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee earlier this year. That bill would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States to 1990 levels by 2020, which would be a 15% reduction, and then a 70% reduction by 2050. It's the strongest bill that's gotten to this point in the legislative process thus far. It's going to see some floor action early next year, and if the U.S. Congress were to pass this bill, that would demonstrate to the rest of the world that the U.S. is serious about reducing its own emissions and would help the United States regain the credibility it needs in order to be a leader in these global negotiations.
Kit Batten is the Energy and Environmental Policy Director at the Center for American Progress. We're talking about U.S. policy on climate change, and if you'd like to get involved in the conversation, the numbers are there on the screen. You can also send us emails to journal@cspan.org. Our first call comes from Peoria, Illinois, on our line for Democrats. Peoria?
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask your guest actually a couple of questions. Number one, how did you get the position you're in? Is that an appointed position? And who appointed you, and what were your credentials to get where you're at? And I feel like everything dealing with energy in our country seems to be led by the oil industry. 30 years ago, our problems with energy should have been addressed back when we had problems with Iraq. I see no reason that we're still working with combustion engines and why oil is even a question of energy in our country. We should have done something about this 30 years ago. And I'd just like to know a little bit about you and how much you're influenced by the oil industry and just why this problem hasn't been solved. I'll get off the line and listen to your answer.
Thank you for your question. I am not in an appointed position. I work for a think tank called the Center for American Progress, and we're a nonpartisan organization, not a governmental organization. My background, I'm a PhD ecologist, a scientist, and I've made the transition into policymaking. In terms of your question about the oil industry, yes, we had an opportunity in the 1970s when we first recognized our dependence on oil and some of the problems that that posed to do something about it. However, times passed, the price of oil went down, and now we realize it's not only the price of oil and our dependence on oil that's the problem, but also, of course, the overwhelming problem of global warming. So it's time to do something about reducing our dependence on oil and coal and other dirty sources of energy. And we, as a nation, have a real opportunity to do something with supporting legislation such as the Lieberman-Warner bill that I mentioned earlier, and by re-engaging in global negotiations such as the Bali mandate.
Next up, Bay City, Michigan, on our line for Republicans.
Good morning. I'd like to ask the young lady, this global warming is nothing but a theory. That's all it ever was and will be. And I'd like to see CSPAN get, a Gore global warming theory with another opposing scientist across the table to counter that. This is a one-way street here. And it's, you'll never see Gore debate with a scientist that's against his theory. You'll never see that. He ain't got a chance. Thank you.
Kit Batten.
Well, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has demonstrated once again in its fourth assessment report, global warming is a human-induced problem. Once again, there have been studies that have looked at all the possible causes of global warming, including aerosols, land use change, solar flares, volcanoes, and man-made greenhouse gas emissions. And the only thing that explains the temperature rise that we've seen globally since the Industrial Revolution is the emission of greenhouse gases, primarily coming from industry that's human-induced. So global warming is a human-induced problem, and we've got to do something about it.
Next up is another student that we have from Burke High School in Omaha, Nebraska. They're on the C-SPAN Campaign 2008 bus. What's your question?
Good morning. My name is Brooklyn Musil. I'm a senior at Burke High School. And in a prior essay you wrote, you said that the surface temperature of the eastern Atlantic Ocean increased nearly 1 degree in the last century, and also that even if we slashed our emissions, it would continue to warm due to the pollution already there. Could this 1 degree increase be due to the warming cycle that the Earth already goes through? Every